if you believe in a common ancestor, then you believe that there is no limits to genetics. I feel that this here, 4,500 years of developing millions and millions and tons of corn in the history of man, proves that there is limits to genetics. We don't just see it in corn, we see it in everything around us. Let me give you an example of some of the main. I'm going to show you that not only is there limits to genetics in reality, also we need things to be alive all exactly at the same time, so that evolution falls down there because there's a sequential order of things. The ecosystem is extremely complex, everything needs to be alive at the same time for things to be in working order. I'll also show you some of the stunning complexity of some of the animals, and not just plants, the complexity, how complex things really are in their workings in their daily lives, as well as the ecosystem. So you've got the ecosystem being extremely complex and needing everything to be alive at the same time, and you've also got the actual design of the animals and the living things being stunningly complex, which would mean that you would logically have to make the leap that these things were designed, because human man in all his knowledge, he could not make things. If he tried to make it with all his knowledge, he couldn't make it, so we have to then make the logical leap that these things were designed. So I'll take you to some of the complexity of pollination plants, right? So pollination is the process by which pollen is transferred from another male part to a stigma, the female part of a plant, thereby enabling fertilization and reproduction. So the way that plants basically have sex is you need various things to be in working order. You need wind to exist, and you also need pollinators, animals that can pollinate. I'll tell you about the two different types of pollination. Abiotic pollination refers to situations where pollination is mediated without the involvement of other organisms. Only 10% of flowering plants are pollinated without animal assistance. So of all the flowering plants, 90% of them need pollinators, insects, for them to be able to reproduce. Okay, biotic pollinator. More commonly, the process of pollination requires pollinators, organisms that carry or move the pollen grains from the anther to the receptive part of the carpel or pistil stigma. This is biotic pollination. Okay, so for plants to exist, we need wind, we need pollinators, and of the flowering plants, 90% of all the flowering plants in the entire world require insects and pollinating animals to come in and do that for them to be able to reproduce. Now they also require soil, so let me take you to soil, right? What is actually soil? So they don't just require for them to reproduce to have different animals alive at exactly the same time, they also require soil as an integral part of plants growing. So as we can see from all these diagrams here, all of them are saying that 5% of soil is decomposed organic matter. So that means that for soil to exist, we also need to have had animals that have been alive and they have decomposed other poo or various things like that, right? Let's actually look into what that 5% is made up of. So we need organic matter for soil to be made so that the plants can grow. We need decomposed organic matter. That is totally blowing evolution out of the water, to be honest with you. Of the 5% that makes up soil, or 10% of that is dead organisms, so I think that's bacterian things, so you would have needed them to have been alive. Roots is another 10%, so that's actually, you're having problems there. In evolution they would have to have been first events. They don't like to own up to that or admit to that, but there would have to have been first events, and you need the decomposing 10% of this 5% is decomposed roots of plants, roots and leaves and things like that of plants which have already been in existence. So for a plant to grow, for the soil to allow the plant to grow, you actually need for other plants to have already been in existence. And 80% of the organic matter is humus. Okay, so I'll take you to humus and I'll show you how complex that is. Okay, humus is a topsoil that contains organic matter. Here we go, right, it is difficult to define humus precisely. It is a highly complex substance which is still not fully understood. So remember when I was saying about in all man's knowledge he can't create the things which God has created, and the life that is in existence. They are saying that their model of evolution is that things just naturally fell into successful ways of surviving, but we're actually looking in the detailed, we're actually looking at it with a fine tooth comb, and we're seeing how complex it actually is. Man can't even understand what humus is, and it is integral to the growth of a plant. So man could not create humus. Humus allows soil organisms to feed and reproduce, and is often described as the life force of the soil. The end product of the process, the humus, is thus a mixture of compounds and complex life chemicals of plant, animal or other microbial origin that has many functions and benefits in the soil. Much of the humus in most soils has persisted for more than 100 years rather than having been decomposed CO2. So we're needing gases as well for humus to exist. We're needing various gases and things to exist, which again, as I showed you at the start, evolution can't explain the existence of these gases. Humus significantly influences the bulk density of soil and contributes to moisture and nutrient retention. Plant remains, including those that passed through an animal gut and were excreted as feces, contain organic compounds. So again, there we're talking about animals having to be alive and doing poos and things like that to contribute to the soil. As I say, I'm not saying that I know everything, I'm just breaking down the evolution theory for you and showing you the holes in it and where it falls down, because I think people deserve to know this. Is not a settled science. Okay, I'm not saying that I know all the answers, but I'm giving you the best information that I know of. Okay, so we've seen how complicated humus is. This is all to do with pollination, how complicated it is to have a flowering plant. You need soil, you need humus. We don't even understand what humus is. Okay, so let me take you to the food chain just to nail this point of the ecosystem and how things all need to be alive at the same time. So we've got, say, a kestrel there, for example. A kestrel would eat a snake would eat a frog would eat an insect would eat the grass, and the sun provides the energy that will bring the grasses up, the flora and the fauna. Now, there's if these were allowed to be in abundance, then perhaps they would eat too much of the grass, and then the grass and the flora and the fauna wouldn't exist anymore. So we actually need the frogs to be alive. If the frogs weren't eating some of these down, right, then they would, as I say, that would be harmful to the grass and the flora and the fauna. If there was too many of the frogs, then the insects wouldn't be pollinating different types of grasses and flora and fauna. So we'll need the snakes to eat the frogs, because if there's too many of them, then they'll eat all the insects and the plants won't be able to grow anymore. And we need the kestrel to come along and eat some of the snakes down, because if there's too many snakes, then they'll eat all the frogs, and there'll be no frogs to eat the insects, and the insects will eat all the grass then. So it's in perfect balance, perfect working order, this whole entire ecosystem, not just the exact detailed breakdowns of soil and humus, etc. that I was telling you about. Let me take you to other simplified forms of, because you could spend whole lifetimes looking into things like this. I don't know all the answers, but you could spend whole lifetimes looking into things like this. It's so complex, it's so detailed, there are so many examples of how complex nature is. I'll just take you to some of the most rudimentary ones that I know so that you can get a basic understanding of it. Right, okay, so plants feed the fish eat the plants, the fish then do poos, and that becomes food for bacteria, and then bacteria turns fish poo into plant food. So there we are, absolute perfect working balance, a designed process, I would suggest. Let me take you to when I was talking about the gases that also need to be in existence. So for soil to, when the soil warms, it gives you increased nitrogen. Nitrogen goes into the atmosphere, and that's good for helping the vegetation. When the soil warms, you get increased microbial respiration, and that goes into the atmosphere and helps the soil. So without the soil there would be no vegetation. Without these gases that, as I explained to you in the beginning on the periodic table, the atheist worldview can't explain how all these different periodic elements came into being. And I'll show you this. So you've got soil that feed the plants feed the animals. Plants also give out residues, and that also feeds the animals. Animals then do poos, and that becomes manure, and that helps the soil. So natural fertilizers and things then go into the soil, and the soil also gives out gases, and all of these things in perfect working balance is what is required to have life, the complexity of life. So the whole entire ecosystem is complex, and then the detailed nature of life itself is complex. So now I'm going to take you on and show you just some examples of the absolute stunning complexity of life itself in detailed fashion, and then that means that logically, if we have intellectual integrity, then logically we must make the leap that life itself was designed or created. Okay, so bees can communicate to each other.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
So what you've seen there is bees actually communicate with each other to tell each other where food sources are. They can navigate by use of the sun, and they can tell each other that. Bees can actually communicate. There's not very many, probably not very many animals that can seriously communicate with each other in a very complex way, that they'll be able to understand an exact definition of where something is. Bees can do it, and they do it by navigating from the angle that they are from the sun, right? So we have to make it an intellectual integrity and make the leap and say that is a process that has been designed. The current narrative of the evolution thread, I'll give you some of the basic rundowns of it, is that single-celled organisms became alive. That's extremely complex as well. I'm not going to get into this at this moment in time, but that's abiogenesis, and even when we look at single-celled organisms, we realise how complex they are. And you can look into that yourself. Look into single-celled organisms. Single-celled organisms then eventually will have given birth to animals, according to evolution, given birth to fish, but single-celled organisms reproduce asexually, so at some point asexual beings were the only things that existed, and they would have to have given birth to beings which had full working reproductive organs, and the reproductive process, as I've been showing you, is extremely complex. When we look into life in detail, it's extremely complex. So that can't just possibly have happened by chance. It just, a single-celled organism just happened by chance to give birth to something that had full working organs, and then that animal had something that it was able to have sex with to create from then a successful species. The chances of that happening is so astronomical, you can't really get it, and I've already showed you how complex the ecosystem is, and with things having to be alive at exactly the same time. At some point, fishes will have to have given birth to amphibians. We don't have any proof of that. We don't have knowledge of that. It's not observed. Amphibians would have had to have given birth to reptiles. That's not observed. We don't have knowledge of that. Reptiles, according to evolution theory, gave birth to both mammals and birds. That's not observed. We don't have knowledge of it. The current evolutionary model, atheist worldview, tells you that mammals originated on the land and then they literally walked back into the sea. That's why mammals exist in the sea, according to the evolutionary thread, evolutionary story. So mammals that were on land, successful survivors on land, literally walked back into the sea. They would have had to have changed their skeleton, they would have had to have changed the way they breathe, they would have had to have changed the position where things are positioned on their skulls. The nose, for example, they would have had to have changed everything, absolutely everything, for mammals to have went back into the sea. What I'm going to show you now, chimps can't talk, right? The reason that chimps can't talk is because they don't have the larynx for it. Their voice box cannot produce the sound with the complexity that humans can, right? But not only that, a brain region critical to speech and language ballooned after humans split from chimpanzees. The man who found this area of the brain that is massive in humans but it's not massive in chimps is Broca, right? There must be something unique about the wiring of the region to explain language, says Sherwood, a neurologist. So it was Broca who discovered this area of the brain that is very large in a human's brain but not very large in a chimp's brain. The researchers noticed Broca's area has swelled disproportionately during our species' evolution. So they're still running with the evolution thread, that's up to them. Human brains are 3.6 times larger than chimpanzees on average, yet Broca's area is more than 6 times larger in humans. So what we're having here, if humans came from apes, right, they would have had to have independently evolved the brain, Broca's area, 6 times larger, right? So even if but they also would have had to have independently evolved to have the larynx and the voice box to actually speak. So what happened, you could have perhaps had an animal which independently evolved the voice box, but it didn't have the swelled Broca's area. So it's very hard for evolution to explain their first events. I think that proves it's so complex. Even if a chimp wanted to speak, it couldn't speak. And it not only that, but it doesn't have the brain area. The Broca's area is not large enough. So I'm showing you some of the stunning complexity that is around us in animals, in life, organisms, plants, soil, and everything. How could chimps have independently evolved different larynxes? When you look at a chimp, you can think to yourself, yeah, I can see the similarities there, but the actual workings of it is so complex that I think It didn't happen. Right, I'll just take you and show you one last thing. Plants can do maths, right? That's a suggestion to me that beings can tap into a higher consciousness. A plant doesn't have a brain, but it can do maths. That's been scientifically proven now. That to me means that probably a higher consciousness knows this knowledge, and the plant itself isn't smart, but it can tap into more closely linked to the higher consciousness probably than humans are, or perhaps all living beings have some type of ability to tap into this higher consciousness. Humans have probably decided to switch theirs off, but as times went on we've probably switched ours off. Plants can do maths overnight to control their food supplies. Plants have a built-in capacity to do math, which helps them regulate food reserves at night. Research suggests UK scientists say they were amazed to find an example of such a sophisticated arithmetic calculation in biology. So it's not just me, it's scientists themselves who discovered this were amazed by it, and probably they can't really fully get a grasp on what that actually means. Overnight, when a plant cannot use energy from sunlight to convert carbon dioxide into sugars and starch, it must regulate its starch reserves to ensure they last until dawn. Experiments by scientists at the John Innes Centre, Norwich, show that to adjust its starch consumption so precisely, the plant must be performing a mathematical calculation, arithmetic division. So it's saying that when they don't have any sun overnight and they need to preserve, the margins are so fine that it's basically a form of maths that they're doing to maintain their life cycle, to stay alive. They're actually doing maths in a simple chemical way that's amazing. It astonished us as scientists to see that, so scientists are astonished there. They don't really fully grasp it yet. This is pre-GCSE maths they're doing, but they're doing maths. That to me means that plants are tapping into a higher consciousness when they're doing that. The higher consciousness has the knowledge, and there is some way of communicating this very sophisticated knowledge between the two entities. And as I say, I think probably, to my mind, all animals can probably do it to a certain degree, all living things can probably do it to a certain degree, but some more than others. Now, at this point you're probably thinking, who's this cheeky guy on the internet, thinks he knows everything? This is the point where if I was arguing with evolutionists, they would say, no, I'm just going to go with all the scientists who have established the evolution theory. I mean, all these scientists throughout history, they're going to be more correct than I am, aren't they? Well, I'm going to show you now, just to get the full grasp of the knowledge. I think that the current living system, political living systems that we use, the idea of a creator would be devastating to them. So what's happened in the past 100 years basically is, if you're pro-evolutionist, if you put forward a pro-evolutionist argument, you'll get funding. If you're anti-evolutionist, you won't get the funding. I can show you examples of that at the very end, but at the moment I'm just going to show you quickly lots of quotes from various scientists throughout the years that have also expressed their doubts about the evolution theory, and I'll do that now.